Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Cradle News Roundup, your one-stop shop for all news West Asia. My name is Esteban Carrillo. I am the head of news for the Cradle, and as usual, I'm joined by my colleagues, content creator and writer for the Cradle, Karim Shami, and writer and editor for the Cradle, Sharmeen Narwani. So today we want to begin by discussing what happened in Moscow. This horrific terror attack that left about 140 people dead, that the Islamic State took responsibility for, but that Russia says it was Ukraine. And the first, it wasn't just the Islamic State, it was ISIS-K, this little off-brand affiliate that operates in Afghanistan that came out following the withdrawal. According to U.S. intel agencies, ISIS-K has existed since 2015, but they really came to the spotlight in 2021 when the U.S. and their chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, when the Taliban, ran them out of town. All of a sudden, you had this group of extremists conducting attacks, and after the U.S. left, there was just a string of attacks, one after the other. Before the U.S. left, they took responsibility for the bombing of Kabul airport, which the U.S. says killed like 140 people. In reality, the suicide bombing killed maybe 12 people. The rest were killed by NATO troops. Where at the airport, that's what the physicians, the doctors who looked at these people said. They died from bullet wounds. So now they reappear again. ISIS-K, they reappear earlier in the year when they bombed the tomb of Qasem Soleimani in Iran on the day of the anniversary of his death. They have launched attacks in Pakistan. They have conducted many attacks in Afghanistan. Now all of a sudden they go to Moscow. ISIS-K, right? Who we at the Cradle have so much reporting about this group from 2021. We have reported about them being, their numbers, essentially this group became extra powerful after the withdrawal of U.S. forces because all of a sudden all of these Afghan-trained army members were joining the ranks. It was just like all of a sudden they have this influx of U.S.-trained soldiers of armament that just kind of points to, again, the discussion we had last week, which is ISIS is a U.S. construct, is a CIA construct, and now they've gone and they hit Moscow in such a horrific way, no? So what do we make of this? First of all, that the U.S. out of nowhere, the Moscow attack happens, and they come out and says, it's ISIS. It's not just ISIS, it's ISIS-K. This brand new, I can't believe it's not Daesh.
I think, one really has to understand what ISIS-K is all about and who its members are. You're right. ISIS itself was a very much a Syrian Iraqi operating force. And then we suddenly start to see them in Afghanistan. Now, why is that? Because for sure, the U.S. had been looking to exit from Afghanistan for a while, but doing it in a way that allowed it a face-saving exit and a completion of mission kind of thing. Of course, they did it very badly in the end without notifying their allies within, no time. But
well, the whole Afghan army fell apart in like a matter of weeks, just like dominoes.
Completely. So, I think we need to go to the beginning. Where did ISIS-K come from? Essentially, ISIS is a group that operated in and came out of the Syrian and Iraqi war theaters. So how all of a sudden do they get to Afghanistan? It's the same story with Al-Qaeda in the past. Al-Qaeda was here and then in Afghanistan, and then all of a sudden it's in Yemen, it's in Syria, in Iraq, etc. So you have to consider the backdrop of Afghanistan, like what was going on at the time. Afghanistan is a strategic node for the then potential Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, okay? And it's a resource-rich country. It was also, from like the late 1990s, looking at developing the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, or TAPI gas pipeline. And a lot of these wars are about pipelines and routes now that we're seeing take place, especially since China's BRI, got off the ground with a huge push. So the U.S. wanted at the time to trash the Iran-India Pakistan pipeline in particular. They didn't want Iran to be part of the pipeline connections in the region. They wanted to undercut Russia in the intersection of Central and South Asia too, which is Russia's backyard. and disrupt China's BRI. So they go into, under the pretext of 9/11, they completely invade and occupy Afghanistan and set into place a program of, destabilization and taking what they wanted from Afghanistan and halting some of these other activities. But Taliban sources in 2021, after they took over Afghanistan again, say that quite a few U.S.-trained soldiers of the previous Afghan National Army were incorporating themselves into ISIS-K to fight the Taliban.
Yeah, but the National Director of Security.
Well,
the NDS.
That's a separate part because the shadow army, in a way, and Pepe Escobar wrote about this in November 2021 for the Cradle, and it was an investigative piece. The shadow army the U.S. left behind are, a hodgepodge of Afghan militias and organizations that had grown in strength during the time they'd been there. And Pepe calls this, the CIA Army, a two-headed hydra. The first is the KPF. The KPF is the Host Protection Force, a paramilitary unit very close to the CIA, based at the CIA's Camp Chapman in Host, operating completely outside of Afghanistan law and budget, and ran a heroin rat line. And, let's not forget that's another big bonus for the American occupation there was the heroin rat line, which laundered billions of dollars through Western financial institutions. And when the Taliban was in 2000, and then again in 2021, the whole heroin industry went dead.
They eradicated.
And we did a story that went viral on this.
This is something that I'm glad you brought up because another, little interesting piece of information that we have is that one of the leaders of this, ISIS-K group is, his name is Shahab al-Muhajir. And he was a contractor for the National Director of Security, for the head of the National Director of Security in Afghanistan, which is, U.S. trained. This man, Amrullah Saleh, who was an official, he was head of the NDS. And he is also... he worked for a warlord, for this Afghan warlord, Rashid Dostum. So the leader of ISIS-K worked for the NDS as a contractor. He also worked for this Afghan warlord, Rashid Dostum, which, in this investigation by the Cradle about the poppy trade in Afghanistan that went viral, we highlight that with the help of this warlord, the U.S. Central Command established a drug corridor from the north of the country to Uzbekistan. So ISIS-K has been, the people behind ISIS-K have been for decades working with the CIA, both in the poppy business and then in this whole, nation building, whatever project that lasted 20 years, the occupation of Afghanistan.
The depletion of Afghanistan.
The depletion of Afghanistan, exactly.
To your point, so this two-headed hydra that the CIA had created before it left was the KPF, the Host Protection Force. But by the way, by 2018, this KPF was estimated to have up to 10,000 operatives. It's not a joke. And what few Afghans know is that they were properly weaponized. They worked with people speaking American English, using American vocabulary, engaged in residential areas, extrajudicial killings, and the scary interrogations that we've heard about that the CIA runs in different countries. But the other head of the CIA Hydra was the National Director of Security, which is the CIA sister organization in Afghanistan, the NDS, and its special forces, which all we know is that there were 4 main units operating their own regional areas, funded, trained, and armed by the CIA. So, in 2015, so when ISIS had reached its height in Syria, the CIA got the NDS to establish new paramilitary outfits to, in theory, fight ISIS, which they later identified as ISIS Khorasan or ISIS-K. But how did ISIS get there? Now, I remember very distinctly covering the Syrian war that there was the SOR, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is based out of the UK, and Western media has quoted SOR extensively during the Syrian crisis. nonstop. Source says this, source says that. These are credible sources according to Western media, okay? But SOAR reported that anti-ISIS Western coalition helicopters were airlifting foreign ISIS fighters, not the Syrian ISIS fighters, but the foreign ISIS fighters out of Deir ez-Zor in Syria. And of course, Western media didn't report this one at all. But it was a shock because at the time, nobody could understand, okay, where are they taking them? Back into the Iraqi theater? They need to shuttle them back and forth? No. Two different sources of the same nationality, actually, told me that the U.S. coalition was airlifting foreign ISIS fighters into Afghanistan, which at the time I didn't understand at all. But in light of what's happened, the U.S. needed to leave behind a dirty fighting force that would blow up mosques, blow up schools, infrastructure, to continue chaos once U.S. forces left, to impede the development of pipelines and roadways, allowing China, Russia, Iran, Pakistan to connect with Afghanistan and various levels.
To keep the country in chaos.
To keep the country in chaos, basically. So, the story of ISIS in itself, we talk about it being a potentially U.S. construct. ISIS-K is really absolutely a U.S. CIA-specific construct.
It's just a name, right, in the end.
It's just a name.
And okay, so...
Especially they come from Afghanistan. And we know that Afghanistan shared borders with China and with Russia. And the border that shares with China is very close to the Uyghur population. And we know Uyghurs are Muslims, and ISIS-K, they are like Islamists. And it's easier for them to find radical Islamists in the Uyghur community.
They actually reel them in and educate them first and then train them for paramilitary.
That's what happened in Moscow recently, because the four of the people that were detained were asked, how did you meet, or who to approach you. The four of them had the same answer, is that we had and
they were interrogated separately.
Yes, separately.
Yeah.
And the four of them said that they were studying via Telegram. They were taking a Dawah course, which is an Islamic course. And of course, this course was very extreme. And they completed the course. And then the operator, which, as we're talking now, it might be the CIA or the Ukrainians or even the Mossad, they approached them. They knew that these four people, they have the extreme mentality, Islamic mentality, maybe to kill or whatever. Because till now we don't know what the course was about. But the four of them, when they completed the course, they were approached by this foreign agent, maybe. And after that, they coordinated and they made this. And we have also to remember that also in Russia, we have, there is high percentage of Muslims. Also, there is 20 million Muslims in Russia. So, of course, when the United States Army knew that they were going to withdraw from Afghanistan, if they withdrew without keeping ISIS-K or a trade behind them, as if they didn't accomplish anything. So they need this trade.
This is an important reason also why, for people who didn't understand, why Russia and China were very vested in the Syrian outcome.
Yeah,
because Syria and then Iraq became the massive training ground for jihadi groups that were funded by Western sources and their Gulf allies. Okay, so they want to put it on the Gulf, but really it's a Western program. It is about training and grooming people. You can't look at the Uyghurs and think of them as an extremist by any stretch of the imagination, or Russian Muslims or Iranian Muslims. They're not extremists. What happens is you go in to communities that may be poor or angry about something, and you start to groom them. And we know this because, decades of U.S. operations, but I remember a few years ago reading a New York Times article, and I can't be right about the percentage, but I swear it was something like 90% of the thwarted terror cases in the U.S., so thwarted, these were potential terror operations, had been infiltrated by U.S. intelligence, FBI, CIA, etc. One has to wonder whether these people were in touch with the FBI, CIA, because they were being groomed to carry out an attack. It's like the CIA, FBI say, well, we're testing them. We're testing people who go to mosques, etc. But no, you're actually giving them the incentive. You're grooming them to set up operations that they wouldn't have otherwise thought about.
Exactly, and just to bring it back to Moscow, to the situation in Moscow, because I also want to just highlight that at the Cradle, since the start of the war in Ukraine, we have had many reports about ISIS fighters, and not just ISIS, also Nusra Front, also Al-Qaeda, being moved from Syria to Ukraine or allowed passage via Turkey to Ukraine.
Yeah.
And this presence of ISIS in the Russia-Ukraine war has been ongoing for the past 2 years. This is not something new. But the fact that ISIS-K is allegedly behind the Moscow attack raises so many questions, Everything you just detailed, Karim. And then there's also, how the operation was conducted, the fact that, they tried to flee. Every time we see ISIS-K do something, or ISIS do something, it's, it's for martyrdom.
Yeah, they want to die on the spot.
They want to die there, that's the point. And no, all of a sudden, these 4 or however many, they fled, And also, why Russia? Why a week after the presidential elections? Why, it's the same, it's to me, honestly, it's like Nord Stream.
It's like it's a Hollywood movie. And it's really, they're trying to see people aren't dumb. Governments keep thinking people are dumb. The news consumers are stupid, and we can see the juxtaposition of all these things and the oddness of an attack, coming out of nowhere, such a violent, aggressive attack on a U.S. adversary state. When Putin comes out of an election smelling like roses with a massive majority mandate from the people. So the whole Western argument of Russians are tired of war. No, the Russians trust their president to make the correct decisions on war, as opposed to what's happening to Joe Biden, who was 30-20% ratings in the U.S. because the Americans don't trust the U.S. participation in the Ukraine war, and its wars in Gaza, etc. So, here's a Putin victory, and then they want to do something, a gut punch to the Russian state, if you will, and Putin. But he handled it very well. While he pointed out in America, if they were Muslims who did something like this, it would just be massive Islamophobia, crypto Islamophobia in all the media headlines and the discussion points. But in Russia, he says, look, these were Islamic extremists, okay? But they are not the ones who did this.
They're not the masterminds.
They're not the masterminds of this operation. And then from Russian media and social media, we also got this very sweet viral posting of a young Muslim Russian boy who helped 100 people escape from the massacre, 100 adults mostly, right? And so, the Russians have a big Muslim population. Of course, the Americans want to stir that up. They've been unsuccessful in the past. After Chechnya, that whole thing was nipped in the bud. And the Muslim community, came out of any extremist elements, just as the Uyghur community has now, through re-education, big investment in Xinjiang and, Muslim areas, have come out of this period of extremism. Zero terrorism in China now, and zero in Russia as well. So then you have this big terror attack by Muslims. It doesn't make sense at all.
Yeah, and just before we move on, I just want to bring up what the head of our team said following the attack, which is after the U.S. Gave their condolences, they said, the trainers lamenting the victims of their dogs.
Yeah.
And, it's it just goes to show you that, to your point, Russia is yes, okay, this may have been a group of people may have been extremist, Islamist, or, they have extremist beliefs to do this, but that doesn't mean that is, Islam behind it or that it's...
Correct. The Russians make a point that this is not at all Islam. Okay, these are extremists. They happen to be Muslim, but are they really? And extremists can exist in any...
Yeah, because the Americans and the Brits, they mastered how to control these groups.
They groom them, they fund them,
as the Nazis,
and then they let them free.
They are Christians.
Because they know they're going to head towards the targets that they want, ultimately. They understand the software of these groups because they created the software. The blueprint is British, And
it was back to like Muslim Brotherhood, that what is in Egypt, and now spreading everywhere.
We should mention groomed. Okay, the Muslim Brotherhood was encouraged by the British, etc., because Arab nationalism was on the rise. So secular nationalist movements, and like the PLO, like Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, who were setting a whole new tone for the world for anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, anti-Zionism, and self-determination. And so they created Islamist movements. I don't want to say the Muslim Brotherhood are British, whatever, tool. I mean, they're British tools for sure, but they're not doing a British agenda. But they were, these kind of movements, grassroots Islamist movements, were ultimately encouraged, funded, and many of them groomed by the British and then the Americans to carry out their agendas to undermine Arab secular nationalism and self-determination in the Arab world.
That's U.S. foreign policy. Across the entire world, that's U.S. foreign policy.
I want to comment. So what happened in Russia is not only because Putin won the election, it also happened one day after Russia used the veto in the UN Council against the U.S.
The resolution
for Gaza. And I think that this is the only choice for the West, because they tried sanctions, they tried to give Ukraine as much weapons as it needs. They bombed the Nord Stream. They did many things, and nothing worked until now. As Putin stated, that now Russia has the most powerful economy in Europe, and that's what he said.
I was in Moscow a few weeks ago. Blew my mind. Everything.
You know.
So they tried everything to destroy the image of Russia, if we can say, because they tried another means that didn't work. And now they are trying maybe their last resort, which is terrorism, because they don't want the Russian economy to be strong as it is. They don't want the image of Russia to be as beautiful as it is today, especially after the interview with Tucker Carlson. Now people, they are saying, oh, Russia is not as we think.
I just want to say, like, the angel of death, Victoria Nuland, before she resigned, she did say Russia can expect a couple of Nazi surprises. But yes, let's move on.
Speaking of UN Security Council resolutions, Israel just lost its mind yesterday when the UN Security Council voted overwhelmingly 14 votes to a U.S. abstention to demand a ceasefire in Gaza until the end of Ramadan. Huge fallout from that.
Yeah, so Israel, as you said, just kind of has gone a bit insane, more than they were before, in particular towards the U.S. You know, there's been like this tug of war, essentially over Rafah between the U.S. and Israel, in which the U.S. kind of comes out in public and says, oh, please don't go into Rafah. And Israel says, we don't care, we will. So yesterday, yes.
Israel says, how dare you interfere in the matters of our state? Israel.
And they have AIPAC.
Exactly. So like yesterday, the U.S. abstains in a kind of like, the best way that can be described is like a little slap in the hand, right? Yeah. Because they wanted to actually do something, just stop sending bombs. So, and now Israel withdraws from the talks in Qatar, says, Hamas intransigence, I guess, is always Hamas's fault. That they don't accept the terms of the deal. The terms of the deal are, for Israel, there's no deal. But they also withdraw a delegation that was supposed to go to D.C. to discuss the terms of the Rafah invasion. The U.S. wants it to be a very, they call it like counterterrorism operations. They call it, they can't just be, like all at war, like you kill everyone left, right, and center. So Netanyahu nixes that. We're not going to D.C. We are pulling out of Qatar. And at the same time, they cut aid deliveries to the north. They just essentially lose their mind. And now, as this is happening, the Israeli defense minister, I don't know if he's still in Washington, but he was for the past couple of days meeting with Lloyd Austin, asking for weapons. And in his comments with Austin, he says that if we don't get enough weapons to eradicate Hamas, whatever that means, in Gaza, for a decisive victory in Gaza, that is going to force our hand to expand the war in the front against Hezbollah in Lebanon.
It actually doesn't make sense. If we don't have enough weapons to fight Gaza, you're going to fight a war with a much bigger player, Hezbollah in the north, that will require far more weapons. So, I mean, it's kind of a quiet threat to the Americans. Keep supplying us, because there's been pushback. it's not the majority for sure, but in the U.S. Congress and other sort of influencers have pushed back, because let's not forget the State Department has a human rights requirement in its weapons sales, which of course the U.S. completely ignores in most things. But it's become so obvious, the human rights violations, that international courts are calling, looking at Israel's actions in Gaza as a genocide, that it's hard to pretend that there is no human rights violation of the State Department requirement for weapons sales to foreign states.
Exactly, and you're seeing, NATO members like Canada, like Finland, like Spain, either cut arms sales to Israel, even though this is, minimal. It's the drop in the bucket when any of these countries does it, but it still carries significance. And the U.S. is, they say Israel is being left alone at the world stage. In reality, it's the U.S. that is being left alone in the world stage, because even its partners are saying, we can't be part of this. We'll defend it to our last breath, but we'll at least, do something to whitewash or roll.
Well, they also understand this is a U.S. war. In a way, I think a lot of Europeans understand that Ukraine is also a U.S. war. We know, and we mentioned several times on the podcast, that Israel ran out of weapons early on in what is now month 6 of the conflict, and that it is primarily U.S. weapons that has been, appearing in Israel's arsenal used against Gaza. So it is U.S. weapons bombing Gaza to bits.
Yeah, and we had a story that also went viral of 100 unannounced ammo shipments to Israel.
I think the story was that there were two massive munitions shipments to Israel that had been declared, but there were about 98 others that had not been declared.
Yeah.
It was a major U.S. publication that said there were over 100.
Like they only publicly admitted to 2 shipments, and then there's over 100 that are under the radar. They found little loopholes, and one of these loopholes is insane. It includes opening up the gates of a huge arms cache that the U.S. keeps in Israel for a future conflict, and telling them, just take what you need, and we'll deal with it later. And that's what has been fueling this war. And now, of course, more likely than not, they've either depleted this cache or are close to depleting it. And that's why you have Yoav Gallant in Washington with a list of weapons that we need. And what do you get from U.S. officials in return? They simply, there's just this talk about maybe we'll send them more precision weapons. Instead of sending them these dumb bombs that have been dropping in Gaza and refugee camps, in hospitals, etc., just killing people by the hundreds, we'll send, finally, after 6 months, let's send them more precision-guided ammunition, because they are, they're starting to make us look bad. That's the level of what the U.S. is willing to do. That, or, abstain at the UN Security Council. But as you said, 14 countries in favor, including a whole bunch of U.S. proxies, and just the U.S. abstains.
The Israeli media, of course, is talking about Gallant's visit to Washington as a, and for his request for weapons, as these weapons are also going to be needed for the northern front, for the front in Israel's war on Lebanon,
where the situation has completely evolved. This is something we haven't touched upon recently, but we have a feature at the Cradle this week that touches upon the how different the battlefield is. And here we have mentioned before that for the first time the security buffer zone exists within Israeli territory, and we've talked about the mass displacement of settlers from the north. But now there's also the deaths of Israeli soldiers, which Israel keeps very close to their chest.
Yeah.
But in comparison to the deaths of Hezbollah fighters, is almost a 1-to-1 ratio, no?
It's a 1-to-1 ratio, and it's a ratio that has been talked about a lot since the 2006 Israeli war in Lebanon, in which the famous ratio is basically means a 1-to-1 ratio of where Hezbollah kills as many Israeli soldiers as Israeli kills Hezbollah soldiers. So that was an astounding development, this near 1-to-1 ratio in the 2006 war. Hezbollah has made sure to keep that ratio in this war. Now, Israel, from the beginning, when it was announcing Gaza soldier deaths, was really keeping mum about the deaths of its soldiers in the north, on the northern front. And we wrote articles about this, how
how like the hospital records didn't match.
Hospitals are filled with like thousands of people with no legs, like 50 of them are blind, etc. These are Israeli soldiers, and yet nobody was killed on the northern front. So the Cradle will be, it's not out yet, but this week the Cradle will put out a story that basically over 200 Israeli soldiers, fighting forces, have been killed in the north, on the northern front. And that matches Hezbollah's number, because Hezbollah always announced its dead, right? Because they made sacrifices.
They honor them.
They honor their dead who made sacrifices for Lebanon. And Hezbollah claims, I think, 232 dead. But the Cradle's reporting will show that there are over 200 Israeli soldiers dead. Now, in 2006, Hezbollah claimed 250 fighters dead. Israel claimed at the end of that war 121 Israeli soldiers dead. But you can double that number easily, because what we've seen from this war and from the last one is that Israel hides its death statistics. It's army casualty numbers.
How long, Karim, until ISIS-K is deployed to Lebanon?
They don't need that.
They don't need that?
No, we have the Lebanese forces.
But I mean, the Lebanese army and Hezbollah a few years ago worked together to purge Lebanon of ISIS and Nusra forces. And they did it without any American coalition, any Americans on the ground, any American.
The Americans tried to delay the battle like as much as they could.
They did.
Yeah.
This Hezbollah ratio is, I mean, maybe people aren't paying so much attention to it. I hope they do after the Cradle story, because it is a very, very important deterrence point scored for Lebanon. It's not just the kill ratio now. It's not just, one Israeli soldier killed for every Hezbollah fighter who's been killed. The ratio has expanded to targets. We now have a target ratio. Okay, so
you mean of the number of attacks, or that
no. The quality of attacks. Okay, the quality of targets. So, for instance, when Hamas leader Saleh al-Aruri was assassinated in Dahiya, which is the southern suburb of Beirut,
at the start of the year,
populated heavily by Shiites, of course, with Christians and Sunnis too. But it is where many Hezbollah and Hamas offices are as well. So it's in 2006, the Israelis carpet bombed Dahiya, its major residential areas, must be noted. So in response to the assassination of Saleh al-Aruri, Hezbollah hit the Israeli Meron Air Base in the Galilee and the Northern Command Center for the Israeli Army in Safad, and this was on January 9th. Okay, so this was a ratio kind of operation. But then Israel hit Saida and Baalbek. They went further. They decided to test these boundaries that Hezbollah had set. Hezbollah hit Meron Air Base again, and the Kela barracks in the occupied Golan Heights. Okay, so you hit new areas, we will hit new areas, but we're not hitting civilian targets like you are, or claimed weapons factories as you are in Lebanon. We're hitting your main points of operation, your essentials. And Hezbollah has warned, come to us, we will take out your airfields. We will take out all your bases, and we because of our missiles, we don't have an air force, but we have targeted missiles. So, of course...
And we're on your doorstep.
We're on your doorstep, yeah. And so this is why gallant's in Washington, D.C., because they have lost the war if they stop the war with Lebanon now, okay? Yeah. And they've lost the war in Gaza if they stop the war with Gaza now, because for Israel, nothing short of a deafening defeat is acceptable for the Tel Aviv decision makers. Otherwise they get themselves out of the war in the same scenarios they did in 2006, where everyone's like, well, you really didn't win the war. And then there was the Winograd Commission showing that Israel was unprepared. I mean, there was a big internal, discussion about how this really was a lost war. So stopping the war in Lebanon, where Hezbollah has established new rules of engagement, Hezbollah's called the shots. Hezbollah has decided when to hit and where to hit, is a huge loss for Israel.
Indeed.
Go back to the recent history from 1978 to 2000. Israel used to occupy the southern Lebanon, which was like around 9%. And usually if somebody throw a rock on an Israeli soldier or even a spy for Israel used to come and bomb Beirut and bomb the airport and kill many people. And usually Hezbollah used to make some operations inside Lebanon where Israel occupied our land. So, but after like 20 years, 25 years now, we see that Israel is unwilling to bomb anything in Lebanon and Beirut because Hezbollah established this golden ratio. It's a golden ratio for me as a Lebanese.
Yeah, Hezbollah established what Israel has been looking to establish, which is deterrence. You know, the roles have completely switched. That's the perfect place to leave off for this week. Thank you so much for joining us. Please make sure to leave a like, to subscribe. In the description below, you will find links to the articles we discussed this week. Please follow us on Instagram, on Telegram, and on X. For the Cradle News Roundup, my name is Esteban Carrillo. I have been joined by Karim Shami and Sharmin Narwani.